Hi, my name's Sheldon. I'm the Chief Resilience Officer with Parks and Wildlife in XML. I'd like to invite you to be part of a new program which DBCA is running in conjunction with the Great Barrier Reef Foundation called Resilient Reefs. Ningaloo is one of just 5 World Heritage listed reefs from around the world to be part of this exciting new initiative. It aims to bring together community members, reef managers and global resilience experts in order to develop innovative solutions to strengthen both the Ningaloo Coast and our communities to be able to adapt to change.
Coral reefs around the world are facing unprecedented challenges, and you might have seen photos like the ones here showing the effects of bleaching. Around 50% of our coral cover has been lost in the last 30 to 50 years around the world, and around 75% of reefs are currently threatened by both local and global stresses. If we look at the situation in Western Australia, around 75% of our coral reefs are currently at or near their lowest level of coral cover on record. And if you look at the situation here in Ningaloo, we've largely escaped the mass bleaching events like has been experienced on the East Coast, but coral cover seems to be declining at monitoring sites across the marine park. The best available science states that by 2041, just 20 years, Ningaloo is expected to experience bleaching at least twice per decade. Now we know that the reef takes around 10 years to recover from disturbances, so experiencing bleaching at least twice in that decadal period means that we're likely to see mortality. By 2049, 10 years further on, it's expected to bleach annually. In recognition of these challenges, in 2016, a meeting of the World Heritage Marine Park Managers for UNESCO affirmed the need to build resilience at World Heritage sites around the world. And in response to that call, the Great Barrier Reef Foundation and BHP Foundation got together to develop the Resilient Reefs Initiative. The aim of the initiative is to develop and pilot a model for resilience-based management at 5 World Heritage coral reef sites around the world, those being the Great Barrier Reef here on the Ningaloo Coast, New Caledonia, Belize and Palau. A key facet of that program is to develop the capacity of reef management agencies, and we do this by access to a range of technical experts around the world from UNESCO, ACOM, the Nature Conservancy and many others. We also hope to develop innovative solutions to the challenges that we face. And one of the ways that we hope to do that is by empowering communities to be involved in those discussions and planning sessions. We're hoping to build and initiate those local actions in order to build the resilience of coral reefs to global threats. Now, when we talk about resilience, we're talking about the capacity of both the reef ecosystems as well as the individuals and businesses and communities that depend upon those ecosystems to survive, adapt and recover in the face of threats. And those threats might be local in nature in terms of pollution or plastics or overfishing, or they may be global in nature, things like climate change.
Although we call it Resilient Reefs, it's about much more than just the coral. We understand that healthy reef ecosystems depend on people, and people depend on healthy reef ecosystems. The Resilient Reefs approach is to strengthen the community and our management systems, as well as managing the reef. And that might include conversations about livelihood diversification, more flexible and adaptive management planning, or opportunities for community engagement in managing the reef.
So when we look at resilience in this integrated way, it becomes clear that ecosystem, community and governance systems are equally important. So while researchers and DBCA have long focused on the ecosystem side of things, in terms of understanding recovery processes, monitoring habitat condition and biodiversity, it's also important that we start to look at the resources and livelihoods and the networks and relationships that underpin our community systems. Governance systems are about how we manage our marine areas and how we manage our coastline. And in that sphere, rules and regulations and things like leadership and management agencies become really important. And certainly when we're talking about resilient reefs, we're equally talking about those ecological processes that we can start to strengthen, and we're talking about the community and governance procedures that we can also start to build upon and make more adaptive and flexible. And I think that approach really makes sense when you just look at a photo of somewhere like Coral Bay, where you've got those amazing corals in Bills Bay that are directly adjacent to buildings and human use areas on the coast there. And a lot of the pressures on those systems are human use pressures. So it's clear that we need to really manage these systems, both ecosystems and community systems, social systems, in concert. When we talk about the scale of this program, it's really broader than the World Heritage Area alone. So while obviously it takes into account the Ningaloo Marine Park area, it also takes into account our coastline, so along Cape Range, Jarabi and Bundigu coastal parks, and the southern coastal reserves, and also pastoral stations down south. It also takes into account the Muron Islands and Exmouth Gulf. Key to this is the communities, so both Exmouth and Coral Bay, and also people that are living outside of those communities in regional areas. Those are key aspects that we want to be thinking about when we're thinking about the Ningaloo region and doing this assessment of resilience. So over the past couple of months, we've been having conversations with members of the community and also with researchers to try to identify what the current state of resilience is for the ecosystem, the community and governance systems at Ningaloo. And I'll be presenting some of the findings of that work here in this video. I wanted to start by touching on some of the emerging themes and some of the potential challenges for the district in the years to come. The first two are related to climate change. So it's predicted that extreme events will be increasing in the future. Extreme events being weather-related events like cyclones, flooding, storm surge, heat waves and bushfire. So these obviously have effects on ecosystems, but they also have effects on the community. We know that the climate is changing, and we're seeing that in terms of increasing ocean temperatures across the park over the past couple of decades. We're also seeing sea levels rise, and we're predicting changes or shifts in ocean currents and ocean acidification. We know that the numbers of visitors on the reef is increasing steadily over time, and numbers of visitors have obvious impacts in terms of physical impacts on the reef. So that might be boat strikes, that might be anchoring, which might damage coral. It could also be pressures related to fishing pressure or pressures on the behaviours of marine megafauna. We know that our communities, particularly Exmouth and Coral Bay, are highly reliant on tourism in the reef, and they're also susceptible to external influences. So we've seen that recently with the pandemic, but it could easily be something like bleaching or even the media account of bleaching that starts to have those influences on tourism and therefore influences on the local community. We know that there's existing threats from oil and gas, which are low probability but high impact if they occur. And there's potential further pressure from industrialisation and coastal development in the future. Finally, there's opportunities for alignment and coordination between management agencies, users and researchers. So there's a lot of potential there for building greater trust between the managers of the park and users of the park, dealing with some of the unsustainable social norms, these ideas that we need to go out and fill the freezer, and also better knowledge transfer and co-design of research would really help the coordination of strategic objectives between management agencies. So if we turn first to the ecosystem component of resilience, it's clear that Ningaloo is a really healthy and dynamic marine environment, and that's related to a couple of different factors. Firstly, we have very few pressures compared to other reefs around the world. We have very little development fronting the reef. And we also have really strong management frameworks and a high level of legislative and regulatory protection at both state and federal levels. We have the additional benefit of being a World Heritage listed reef, and that provides international leverage in terms of ensuring the protection and conservation of our marine areas. We're also protected from a natural standpoint by the ocean currents and the regional weather patterns that surround us. So we know that the Ningaloo current brings cool water up during the hottest part of the year, and things like upwellings and seasonal cyclones can also serve to cool down the water, and that in the past has prevented us from those mass coral bleaching events. What that results in is a high level of structural complexity and habitat diversity, and we're seeing high levels of species richness, abundance and diversity in things like fish species, coral species and invertebrates. The populations of iconic species, and by this I mean things like mantas, humpbacks, adult turtles, whale sharks, those things that really bring in tourists and really typify the Ningaloo experience, those populations are relatively stable to our knowledge. We also know that there's fairly low occurrences of coral disease and drupella. While they are present on the reef, they seem to be at sustainable levels. We are, however, starting to see some changes, and we can see this on the right-hand side with the graph of seawater temperature, which has risen by about a degree over the last 30 years. And with this, coral cover seems to be declining at some monitoring sites across the park. And you can really see that that decline has started around the mid-2000s and accelerated around 2011, 2013 when we had some bleaching events. And if we dig down into where these declines in coral cover are occurring, we can see that in the northern sector, between the tip of Northwest Cape down towards Coral Bay, coral cover has been relatively consistent over the past 30 years. But we're seeing declines in the eastern sector around Bundeedi and the Muir Islands, and also in the southern sector, so that's the reefs south of Coral Bay. This decline is correlated with increasing sea surface temperatures, and it's also, particularly in the eastern sectors, correlated with marine heat waves, which occurred in 2011 and 2013 and caused significant bleaching in those areas. Now, I think the question on many people's lips is what's happening with fish stocks. And the one thing that we can say is fish stocks are really variable and the dynamics around fish stocks are in some ways uncertain. So it's certainly an area that we're going to have to do a little bit more work on to understand in the context of resilience. So I've mentioned climate change already, but I wanted to have a chat about some of the potential impacts of climate change and how they might affect the marine ecosystem. So certainly the most concerning impacts for corals are increasingly frequent and intense marine heat waves. And we know when corals get hot, they expel their symbiotic algae, which provide them with food and nutrients, and they turn that really white bleached colour. Now, bleached corals aren't necessarily dead corals. So if temperatures go down in a relatively short amount of time, those corals can take back up those algae and keep on growing. But if temperatures remain high, then it'll actually cause mass mortality of corals across a reef area. We also know that marine heat waves cause a loss of seagrass and macroalgae, and these provide foundational habitats, particularly in the Exmouth Gulf, for fish species, dugong, turtles, a range of invertebrates. Finally, there's potential changes in relation to the way that marine species reproduce and recruit as a result of increasing temperatures and particularly those extreme heat events. Now, there's a range of other impacts of climate change that might have impacts over the long term at Ningaloo. So increasing average temperatures, so not necessarily heat waves which occur over the space of a month or two, but longer term increasing average temperatures may have effects in terms of the range of species. So at the moment, Ningaloo sits on a transition zone between temperate and tropical species. And as water temperatures rise, we're expecting to see fewer temperate species and potentially more tropical species becoming common. And we're already seeing this with species like the western rock lobster and also certain species of prawn that are prevalent in the Exmouth Gulf. We're on the brink of possible impacts on turtle populations, and this is in relation to the sex of turtles and turtle hatchlings being determined by temperature. So if you raise the temperature of a turtle nest by just 1 or 2 degrees, it can mean all of the hatchlings become female. And this is having already impacts across northern Australia and really important rookeries like Rain Island, where they haven't had male hatchlings commonly born for about 20 years. And finally, increased or changing environmental conditions can increase the potential for coral disease, new coral disease, or predators to move into the region. And we're particularly concerned in relation to very novel coral diseases that we might not have seen before, or potentially things like crown of thorns starfish moving into the region. So you may have heard of crown of thorns starfish from the damage that they're doing to the Great Barrier Reef. Once they reach outbreak proportions, they can certainly have a significant impact. And we know that there are large populations of crown of thorns starfish in the Dampier Archipelago and areas north of Ningaloo, but at the moment it's too cool for those species to become established. In the next 25 years, with warming temperatures, it might be the case that conditions are more favourable for the establishment of crown of thorns starfish. Increases to cyclone and storm intensity obviously have impacts on the physical damage to tidal habitats and reefs and seagrasses. And as a result of the loss of habitat from that storm damage, we can see declines in key species. There's very little effective sedimentation on the west coast, but there are some reports of sedimentation as a result of flooding in the Exmouth Gulf. So more severe rainfall events and more severe cyclones may increase the frequency of this sedimentation effect. We know that there have been steadily rising sea levels, and there's the potential that reefs won't actually have the growth rate to keep up with the changes in sea level. So a really, really healthy reef like Ningaloo with no disturbance should be able to grow fast enough that it keeps up with sea level rise at currently projected rates. But we know that we're going to have impacts like bleaching, like more severe cyclones that are going to cut that growth rate down. And once we have more common disturbances, it's possible that sea level will rise quickly enough that there's more wave action that impacts those reefs and more physical damage that occurs. And we also know that rising sea levels causes increased coastal erosion along our beaches, with resulting loss of seabird and turtle nesting areas. And finally, ocean acidification. So acidification refers to changes in ocean chemistry. As CO2 in the atmosphere gets pulled down into the seawater, the water becomes slightly more acidic, and it makes it harder for species like corals and zooplankton and phytoplankton to form those hard skeletons. So we haven't seen any measurable impacts of ocean acidification at Ningaloo yet, but potentially within the next 25 to 50 years, those effects will become more apparent. Climate change certainly isn't the only threat to ecosystem health at Ningaloo. We have, as I've said, visitor numbers increasing steadily over time, and with that comes increased boating activity, increased physical damage to the reef in high-use sites, and potentially increased pressure in terms of fishing and people interacting with marine animals. There are obviously threats from potential development or industrialisation, and this has been a topic of debate within the community for a long period of time now. And those threats are particularly in terms of light and noise pollution and possible sedimentation effects, particularly within the Gulf. And finally, it's been noted that there are coastal habitats that are degraded along the Ningaloo Coast, and that could have impacts on the reef, and it could also have impacts on just general levels of enjoyment and the overall appeal of the reef area. So if we move now to community, it's clear that there is a really strong connection to local marine environments, and there's a high level of volunteering and a network of really engaged community groups that actively contribute to both environmental and social or community stewardship. Surveys find that in general, users are confident the marine park is well managed, and they believe they have fair access to undertake the activities that they enjoy. And the levels of support for sanctuary zones and increased management at Ningaloo are amongst the highest of marine parks within Australia. We've recently done some analysis that the reef and the coastline contribute around $110 million of additional value annually to the local economy and support around 1,000 jobs. So it's clear that the community and the majority of the community seem to support further growth, but not at the expense of the natural environment and a safe, secure community. So particularly, I think there's a recognised need for greater full-time employment opportunities and some livelihood diversification in order to retain people and services within the area. But balancing conservation of the natural environment with a desire to build a more diverse and sustainable economy, I think, is an ongoing challenge and an ongoing conversation. If we extend the analysis of climate change impacts to the community now, it's clear that there are a number of ways in which climate change may affect the way that we live in Coral Bay and Exmouth in the future. For me, some of the most important ways are the increasing average temperatures and the impacts on human health and the seasonality of visitation to Ningaloo, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in upcoming slides, but also the changes to extreme events, putting more pressure on our emergency response systems, and also potentially increasing the amount of damage to property infrastructure and the danger to lives. We're also seeing potential for increased damage to property and cultural sites along the coast where they are very close to the coastline as a result of rising sea levels, and potentials for decline in tourism as a result of some of the ecological impacts that we've talked about in previous slides. In terms of some of the challenges that we're facing, we've already talked about the impacts of increasing visitation to the area in terms of ecosystems, but it's worthwhile thinking about what some of the impacts would be of increasing the numbers of visitors to the area in terms of community values, and particularly if those visitors don't necessarily share the same values of marine stewardship, of the coastline, and a commitment to a safe and secure community. We've also noted that there's a really strong reliance on the reef and tourism within the local economy, and that presents a vulnerability which we've seen as part of the COVID-19 pandemic. But it also is a potential vulnerability in terms of environmental impacts of climate change. We saw this on the Great Barrier Reef, where the media got hold of reports of mass bleaching within those events in terms of 2016 and 17. And they put out a widespread message that the reef was dead. And that caused around 1 million visitors to be deterred from coming and risked around 10,000 jobs within the region. I spoke about increasing average temperatures over time as part of a previous slide, and this graphic really shows annual temperature within Australia since the turn of the century. And you can see since the 1980s, we've been increasingly experiencing above average temperatures. Now, a lot of people will say, look, we live in a really hot climate. What's an extra degree or two really going to mean? Well, it becomes apparent when you look at the health implications of heat waves and extreme heat, which have caused more deaths in Australia than all the other natural disasters put together. So if you put together all the deaths that have been caused by cyclones and flooding and bushfires, they're still outweighed by the health implications of extreme heat. So this is certainly something that could be significant for our community well-being and also for our health services in the future. Alongside those increasing temperatures, we're seeing a lengthening of Australian summers by about a month and a shortening of winter periods. This is potentially a consideration for tourism operators who are looking to increase or lengthen their season and decrease their off-season. But it's also potentially significant for the seasonality of residency within Exmouth. So there could be an increasing number of people who move down to Perth for the summer and increasing numbers of people that are moving in and out of the area on the basis of heat and weather. We also know that there is a limited redundancy in terms of critical infrastructure and transport networks. So when we do have extreme weather or we do have cyclones and flooding, we often get cut off here in Exmouth and in Coral Bay from the greater transport network, and we also have limited redundancies in terms of our energy systems. And finally, there are a number of cultural sites located in close proximity to the coast that are at risk from coastal hazards such as coastal erosion from cyclones and storm surges. If we move now to governance, so governance being the way that we manage our ecosystem and our community, we know that there's a high level of legislative and regulatory protection, as well as Ningaloo being a listed World Heritage Area. And visitors and residents generally agree that the management of the area is effective and are supportive of increased management. We have at DBCA a really strong commitment to facilitating the involvement of TOs in the management of the marine park and the Southern Coastal Reserves. And there are joint and co-management arrangements in place with both TOs and with bodies like Shire and Fisheries in order to manage that really complex set of tenures across the Ningaloo Coast. We also recognise that in addition to traditional owners, there are a range of community conservation groups and local commercial operators which play key roles in collaborating with us in managing the Ningaloo Marine Park and in achieving those management outcomes. And while we do have those really strong management frameworks in place, conversations with community members, researchers and managers have highlighted a range of opportunities for improvement in the way that we're actually managing the Ningaloo Coast. The first of these is around the development of flexible and adaptive management approaches. So when we're planning for climate change, when we're planning for any unknowable future, there is the potential that things will come out of left field, that things will happen that we don't anticipate, and that changing environmental conditions will interact with really complex ecosystems in ways that we don't expect. So we need to have management approaches and ways of dealing with that which are quite responsive and approaches which mean we can trial and learn as we go. There's also, at the moment, relatively limited integration of climate change within existing management plans, and there's no overarching climate change for the region, which would really help to align some of those strategic objectives of the various management agencies. We're hearing from the community that there could be more opportunities to be actively engaged in the management of the Ningaloo Marine Park, and also that there are community concerns around compliance matters, particularly around reported compliance in sanctuary zones and there not being a visible outcome of that. And certainly we can do more to address those community concerns about relaying the processes related to compliance and strengthening compliance where need be. There are certainly opportunities to more effectively coordinate or align objectives between the various management agencies at a strategic level. Certainly operationally, there's close cooperation between parks and fisheries and Shire on the grounds, but potentially there could be more done in terms of co-management or co-planning at a strategic level, which would result in more efficient use of resources. And finally, there's a huge amount of research that goes on in Ningaloo. It's a real sort of hub for attracting research, but it's been noted by the community that there could be improvements to the effectiveness of the knowledge transfer between researchers and the community, whether that be through making research available in a more accessible format or doing more forums and talks, but also that there needs to be more research which actively informs management on an on-ground basis. And this could look like co-design of research between researcher and reef managers, or it could also look like better relationships during research and after to communicate those outcomes in a more effective way. So as a result of some of those conversations with managers and researchers and the community members, we're starting to build up a really comprehensive picture of the current state of resilience of both the Ningaloo Coast and communities, as well as some of the emerging threats and challenges that we might face in the future. And I think it's a really great time to go back to the community to present some of our findings and also invite a more broader and open discussion about what we want for the future and what some of those innovative solutions might be to overcome those challenges. In terms of the Resilient Reefs project, we've identified and appointed a working group made up of representative members of the community, which will provide guidance to both the stakeholder engagement process and the development of a resilient strategy. We're currently in the middle of stakeholder engagement, so you have many opportunities to be involved either online or in person at upcoming workshops. And after that stage, we'll be going into some action planning and prioritisation before hopefully coming out with a resilient strategy by the end of the year. Now, Resilient Reefs isn't just a strategy development process. We also have up to $1 million worth of seed funding to actually get projects on the ground and implemented once we come up with that resilient strategy. So we're really looking forward to early next year when we can start putting on-ground actions into place and really start working with the community in a more active and engaged way.
Resilient Reefs is an opportunity for you, as a member of the community, to have a voice and to be involved in planning the future of our reef, coastline and community. We want to hear from you about what you want Ningaloo to look like in 20 years, the key challenges we're going to face, and some of the innovative solutions we can use for overcoming them. You can contribute your ideas via the Resilient Reefs website, by participating in upcoming community workshops, or by contacting me at the Parks and Wildlife Office in Exmouth. Thanks for your time today, and we look forward to hearing from you.